Landlords have been saying it for years, but economists are now in agreement. The rent control policies that are put into place are leading to a shortage of affordable housing. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over once again the topic of rent control and how rent control actually is doing the exact opposite of what they intended for it to do. Okay, the intention of rent control is to be able to keep rents affordable for people, make it so there's more affordable housing out there, but it is having the opposite effect. And it's having the opposite effect because it is driving landlords and property developers out of the business. It's making it so expensive to build and so difficult to rent properties that less people want to do it. I mean, it's pretty obvious that if you take away the financial incentive for a real estate investor or a real estate developer to rent out properties, guess what? Less of them are going to want to do it. Now, there's still going to be people out there who, they're going to operate their properties whether there's rent control or not. They're going to figure out some way to get around the law or some way to maximize their profits, right? But the number of people doing it is going to be less. That's why in cities like New York and San Francisco, over time, you see a declining number of units that are available for rent, especially the number of rent controlled units. Okay. And the new development is much, much slower. Even if it is initially exempted from rent control policies, eventually, most cities, they make it so that newer development eventually becomes underneath the policy of rent control. So that makes it so that there's a much smaller pool of people who are willing to buy those properties and makes those properties very, very expensive. So, yeah, this is just what I've been saying for a long time, but it's nice to read an article where they talk about, hey, economists are saying the exact same thing. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like, subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below, and let me know what you think. Do you believe that rent control is actually leading to a shortage of affordable housing in the places where it's already in place? And part of the reason I bring this up is because, as I talked about before, they're still talking about nationwide rent control policies. Okay, like the federal government somehow stepping in and then creating housing policies, kind of a backdoor way of doing it by going after federally backed loans and mortgages. Okay, so it's wrong in my opinion that they're trying to implement this sort of thing, but when the government puts something into place like this, there's really nothing we can do other than try to find loans that are not backed by the federal government, where we don't have to comply with their rules and their regulations, and that's going to be possibly a quite much more expensive loan. Okay, so yeah, we're being put in a very, very bad position where the government wants to take over housing. They want to take away property rights. They want to have full control, and they want to put these artificial price controls into place, and it's going to have a negative effect on the market overall, not to mention our personal investments. Okay, so anyway, let's get into this article and see what it says. This article is coming from foxbusiness.com, and it says rent control laws could be contributing to a shortage of affordable housing. Economists warn against imposing price controls as rent caps lead to housing shortages. And this is obvious to any of us. Okay, any of us landlords, that is. Now, there are tenant groups, and they will deny it, or they'll bring up some, you know, weird economist who somehow sees, the counter argument and says, "Oh no, that isn't right. That isn't right. Our rent control policy, if we put it into place, it'll be the only one throughout the entire world, throughout all of history, that will actually work." Yeah, whatever. Okay, it's just like those people who think that if they somehow are able to implement socialism, they will create the perfect socialist system that works. It never works. It never works. It's a failed system, and it will lead to disaster. So anyway, let's get into the article. As the cost of housing in the U.S. has surged in recent years, movements have cropped up across the country seeking rent control measures in an effort to stabilize prices. However, such laws could be making the problem even worse. Despite warnings from economists, rent control is becoming more and more popular in progressive strongholds. Oregon led the charge in 2019 when the state imposed a cap on older units, and California followed suit in 2020. Since then, municipalities in Illinois, Colorado, Massachusetts, and elsewhere are considering similar moves. Many states had various forms of rent control in the 1970s, another time of high inflation. However, several banned rent control after that when there was a consensus that price controls were destructive policies. Now the trend has reemerged. So it's funny that they mentioned in the article that many of these places actually had rent control before, back in the 1970s. Now, a lot of the people who were around back then, they're either very old or they've passed away. So we're left with a lot of people who are renters now who are younger. They do not have the memory of what happened back in the 1970s. I don't have the memory of that, right? Now I'm in my mid 40s, okay? I don't know what the rent control policies were like and why they were so destructive, right? But I can read. I can read, and I do read about history, about why these rent control policies were thrown out in the first place. Why the voters thought, hey, this stuff is awful and we need to get rid of it. In places like Massachusetts, where they banned rent control, which, as left leaning as Massachusetts is now, it's hard to believe that that state ever would have thought, oh, we have to ban rent control. It's hard for me to believe, but that's exactly what they did. And from what I read, it was due to the fact that basically all development in the state had come to a complete standstill. Nobody wanted to build anything. No new housing units, nothing, because they sat there and they looked at it and they were like, we cannot make a profit. We cannot make a profit, and it's not worth investing in this place. And so the voters sitting there looking at this, they were like, hey, we don't have any new housing being built, and our prices are still sky high, and we're creating an illegal black market. Like, rent control creates a black market on rental units, and you'll see that in places, right? And you're thinking to yourself, well, how is there a black market? Are there landlords out there who are renting rent control units for higher than the rent control rate? It's like, no, not landlords. There are renters, tenants, who actually have rent controlled units, right? And they pay very, very low monthly rents on them, and then they sublease them to other tenants for market rate. So in cases like that, there's no net benefit of having rent control in place, and that is very, very common. Okay, so yeah, it's really more. There's a lot more going on than what people are talking about when we're talking about rent control. Ryan Bourne, chair for the public understanding of economics at the Cato Institute Center for Economic Studies, said economists overwhelmingly agree that imposing rent control tends to reduce the amount and quality of affordable housing, and explained why in an interview with Fox Business. Bourne said that at a time when cost of living concerns are such a pressing issue, rent tends to be families' single greatest expense, so it is natural for politicians to look at ways to make people's costs of living more affordable. However, when considering the underlying economics of rent control, it becomes much less simple than that. Like, in my mind, I think to myself, hey, there are other ways that we can help deal with the problem. Okay, a lot of the biggest expenses for a lot of people who are renters right now include not just the rent, right, but look at transportation costs, specifically cars are very, very expensive. I can't remember how much they said that the average price of a new car was now, but I think it's close to $50,000. $50,000, and they want you to pay for this car in 5 to 7 years, and you're like, wait a second, I've got $1,000 a month car payment here. I've got $1,000 a month car payment, and no wonder a lot of people are struggling to make their rent. Okay, throw on top of that, everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people have student loans right now, so they're paying hundreds of dollars a month towards student loans, and you start to realize, hey, with the inflation and other things such as food and insurance, etc., that yeah, you're going to have a lot of renters struggling. You're going to have a lot of people struggling overall. Now, that's not to say that landlords aren't suffering the same consequences of inflation as everyone else, because we are. Okay, but I am saying that I understand why renters are going through so much trouble, and how easy it is to manipulate them into believing that rent control somehow is the solution, when we need to be focusing on getting all of our costs down, not just rent. Okay, bringing the you put an artificial price control on the rent, and for some reason, a lot of these tenants won't see the sort of savings that they think they're going to see. they're going to see increased expenses in other areas, and that's a huge problem. So yeah, in a time of high inflation like right now, you're just going to have a lot of people throwing these rent control proposals out there, and they're going to be counterproductive. So we need landlords and property owners and business owners and economists and smart politicians who know how to read, and a lot of the left leaning ones don't, obviously, because they don't read the economic studies. But we need the smart politicians to stand up and say, this isn't a feasible policy. This is a very negative policy that will end up hurting you overall. Capping rents at a time when demand for property is growing strongly creates a situation where you have a shortage of rental accommodation relative to demand. So it creates shortages, Bourne said. And to the extent they create shortages, that can actually kind of raise the underlying market rents, because if you kept rents below market rates, a lot of landlords will decide to convert their properties to condos or sell them for owner occupation. So, quite frankly, he added, it makes the kind of underlying market rate of property actually more expensive rather than less expensive. The more coverage from rent control, the more damage, and the policies are more worrisome in places where the laws are applied across the board, according to Bourne. So yeah, and that's he said the exact same thing that I say in all of my videos about rent control. That it is actually making things more expensive by creating a shortage. It creates a shortage of housing because there will be more demand when the prices are lower. And the real effect of supply and demand is it drives costs up. And the costs that will be driven up are the costs of the places that are not under that sort of regulation. So if that's new construction, then a lot of the new construction stuff will be just skyrocketed, super expensive stuff, because that's all you can find. And that's what people will be competing for. That's why New York City, even though there's a very strong rent control policy there, and there's nearly a million units of rent controlled property there, right? Still has the most expensive housing costs in the entire country. You know, so your rent control policy isn't having the effect that you thought it was going to have. Yet the number of housing units is in continual decline, and there I keep reading articles about 40,000 units being warehoused because it's too expensive to fix them rather than rent them out. So I'll put a link to this article in the description. You can read the rest of it. It's a good article. It has links to some of the studies that were done that prove the points that I'm always trying to make.